Hey everyone, welcome to Reasoned World. In this episode, I'm going to talk about the current government shutdown. Going to give you a sense of why I think it's important. You might not be interested in politics that much, but it does affect your life. I'm going to try to convince you of that. And then we'll get into kind of the background structure of government, just so I can kind of lay the foundation, a little bit of kind of Civics 101 to lay the foundation before getting into the dynamics of the shutdown itself. I will then move into the dynamics of the shutdown, helping explain why, how that happens. Then I'll pull out kind of a core pattern or feature of the shutdown itself that I think is at play that will help kind of explain the underlying mechanism behind it. And finally, I will show you how that mechanism plays out in other areas of, let's say, science and technology, so you can see that it is actually a universal pattern of systems in general. And I think that'll give you a more rational, reasoned way to think about the current government shutdown. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So why should you bother caring? Again, maybe you're not really interested in politics, but it does affect your life. It does have trickle-down effects, especially when something like this goes on for a prolonged period of time. If you take a think about Social Security nets, right? The Social Security, the Medicare, things like that. Things that get processed and payments that get processed within those information flows tend to get stalled. Sometimes they get downright halted. And that's obviously going to be a problem. So if you're somebody, let's say you're 65 and older, or you're somebody with a disability, or you are somebody where you're in a family unit where the breadwinner has been killed, deceased, is no longer there, available to make those types of payments into the family, then it's going to affect you, right? There's other things beyond Social Security. You've got, let's say small business loans and mortgages. Those can end up getting stalled. You have travel, which affects a lot of people, right? Think about airlines, right? The flights can either get delayed or sometimes even canceled. TSA agents can definitely have less people than they're supposed to because the funding isn't there. It's a critical, necessary function that has to keep going, but they don't get paid during the shutdown period typically. So that's going to get delayed. So they might just call in sick, or they might leave, go get a different job. And so anyway, travel ends up becoming a real problem. Think about the Food and Drug Administration that has to do a lot of the inspections that they do on foods. Those positions can go without pay or actually just get really delayed or even halted during a shutdown. The more on the agricultural side, those are absolutely necessary, so they continue, but those workers might be doing it without pay. It's all going to have systemic issues that affect the quality of our everyday lives. There's also, whether that's civil servants or government workers that don't receive pay, active military that don't get pay, things like this. So basically the gears just start to kind of stop flowing and money doesn't get where it's supposed to go because all of this is coming under the legislative branch. Congress, which controls the purse, they're not passing the same bills. We'll get into that in a bit, but money isn't flowing to the agencies, to the places where it needs to go. And, whether we're talking Social Security, whether we're talking mortgages or small business loans or travel, people can't do what they need to do. They're not getting paid, and it's going to affect things. So it does affect us. And I think you should be interested in something like the government shutdown. We're obviously talking about the U.S. government here, and it does affect your life. And even if you're not living in the United States, the United States is such a big market player. Again, it can kind of jam the gears and things can't go the way they should, arguably even at a global level. Okay, so let's do a little Civics 101. Let's just kind of talk about the structure of government in general. Most of you probably know all this already, but let's just kind of lay kind of that bedrock down so that when we start talking about some of the dynamics of the shutdown itself, we have that backdrop system that it's playing against, right? That kind of controls where things are and how that happens. So obviously we have the three levels of government, right? We've got the federal level, got the state level, and we have the local level. And at the federal level, which is what we're talking about here, for the most part, we have the three branches of government, and we're going to have the legislative, we're going to have the executive, and we're going to have the judicial, right? And you can kind of think of it as legislative branch being kind of like the inputs of a system, and you could think of the executive as being the processing, and then you've kind of got the judicial, which is the interpretive layer. More specifically, you can say the legislative branch controls the purse, right? This is where policy and budgeting come into play. So allocation of money, right? Appropriation, where things are going to go, that's all controlled by the legislative branch of the government. And the executive branch is where you're going to have the president and the vice president, and you're going to have the agencies, and they are essentially going to be the ones that spend the money, right? don't control the purse. They got to get the money first, but once they have it, they can go and spend it and start the essential processing, if you will, of the government. And then the judicial branch is, interpreting the laws that are made, let's say by Congress and then within the legislative branch, and resolving disputes and all that kind of stuff. So we're going to focus on the legislative branch here of the federal level of the government because that's where Congress is. And Congress is composed of two core pieces, right? You have the House of Representatives and you have the Senate. And the House of Representatives is going to have 435 members to it. And those members are coming as representatives from the various districts, right? So all the different states out of the 50 states, they are divided up into districts. And each district is about 760,000 people. And they will have a representative from that district that then acts as a member within the House of Representatives. And so the House of Representatives is kind of like passing bills quickly that are more partisan and that are supposed to be the voice of the people in terms of representation because it's population-based, right? Kind of population-based. I mean, it's still divided up by districts, so an interesting kind of dynamic at play here when it comes to districts is that any votes that are beyond, let's say, the 760,000 don't really count in a way. You still get to vote, but they don't have any representative or representation power to them. So there's only so much representation efficiency to the House of Representatives because it's based on district representations, and districts can only be about 760,000. So if you take something like Los Angeles or Chicago or New York City, where you've got obviously more than 760,000 people who are clustered there, but let's say the district is still just in that one spot. In other words, a district could have well over a few million people to it. Anything beyond the 760,000 isn't actually counting as a vote in terms of helping with the representation, right? It only caps out at 760. Anyways, so you get the 435 members, and so you have to, in order to pass a bill, you have to have, let's say, at least a simple majority, which would be the 218. Now, that's assuming all members are present in the House of Representatives. If they are not, then those numbers will change a little bit in terms of how many votes you need to pass the bill. But the House of Representatives, just call it the House, is passing bills typically pretty quickly. It's usually, there's not a lot of friction there. And, they're pretty partisan, and it's often, as it is now, Republican controlled. And that just has to do with the fact that the way the districts get laid out in the United States, you have a lot of rural areas that have a lot of districts to them. And so because rural areas tend to vote more Republican, you get a lot of Republican representation. So we typically think of, or at least this is the case now for sure, that the House is Republican controlled. And so you expect Republican-type bills to get passed there. Now, on the other end of that is the Senate. And the Senate is kind of like a buffer against the quick-passing bills of the House, right? The House is going quick, but the Senate slows things down, deliberates on them. It's kind of a buffer against it. And as is the case now, it's actually Democrat-controlled, slightly Democrat-controlled. So it's not really agreeing necessarily with everything that's coming through from the House. And so the representation in the Senate is going to be based on senators that are elected, and you get 2 for every state. There's 50 states in the United States, so that's going to be 100 senators total. To get that simple majority, in order to pass a bill in the Senate, it would have to have 51, unless there is a filibuster. In that case, you would need maybe what you call like a supermajority, which would be 60 votes to pass. A filibuster is going to be when basically people, the members of the Senate, the senators, are slowing down the process kind of on purpose, right? And there could be a number of ways that this can happen. Traditionally, this is basically just speaking longer. So they'll take longer to say what they're going to say when they have their chance to speak, and it will slow down the process. And this still happens. But there are other ways that you can kind of do this. And that's known as the filibuster. And that's a hotly debated thing, right? Whether or not the filibuster should be allowed and all this kind of stuff. But if it's a filibuster, you need 60 votes. Otherwise, you just get the 51 to pass something. And yeah, I think that's all I want to say again, that's legislative branch, that's Congress, that's House, that's Senate, that's members, that's different types of representation. And the idea, obviously, is that both the House and the Senate have to pass the same bill. So whatever bill comes up, if there's like 12 major types of bills that are passed every whatever year or whatever, those both have to be passed. And so they have to agree on what's in that bill, right, in order for that to happen. Okay, so now that brings us to something like a shutdown. Now, again, I think most of you in that last 5 minute diatribe, you probably know all that already. And I don't know if I explained it the best way possible, but just that's kind of the core structure we're dealing with, right? The foundation of US government. Now, so what is a shutdown? Well, a shutdown is going to occur when you have the House not passing the same bill as the Senate. Or I guess a better way to say that is they both can't pass the same bill because they're not agreeing. Okay. So they come to loggerheads. And, so there's all kinds of examples of what this might look like. These are pretty typical, but they're also kind of the ones that are happening now. So let's say the Republican-controlled House wants to pass something like a defense bill or something like that, right? They believe in national security. They want borders, right? They want to raise the wall. They want big military spending, maybe 800-odd billion towards the military, this kind of stuff. Democrat-controlled Senate is going to push back against that. They're not really concerned so much with defense and military, or they don't think that's the way it should go. They're obviously more concerned with Social Security, the social nets that are in place, talking about how shutdowns affect things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so they're going to come to loggerheads on that. And it's not that, Republicans want to get rid of Social Security altogether necessarily. It's not that the Democrats want to completely, let's say not spend anything on the military or defense, but just not that much or not to that extent, or even not that way. Like if you take the border wall as an example, the Democrats might want to defend it more with like technology, like maybe facial recognition and cameras, as opposed to just building more physical walls, which is what maybe the Republicans are favoring. And there's all kinds of arguments about why one might be better than the other. Again, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, right? The Senate is going to want to focus largely on that, whereas the Republicans in the House might be trying to pull some of that away, not wanting to get rid of it, but saying, maybe it's really inefficient, it doesn't need that much money, or there's better areas to allocate that money. And we just don't think it needs to be as aggressively funded, it being Social Security, let's say, as the Democrats are saying. Or you take something like the climate, right? Democrats are going to be very much concerned with climate change and the climate goals and all the kind of things that you would put in place to kind of like maybe reduce carbon footprints and all that kind of stuff. Whereas the Republicans, again, maybe don't want to get rid of it altogether, but they're saying, look, it doesn't need that much funding, or it's really inefficient. We think maybe money gets wasted when it tends to get geared towards things like climate. It's not really making a difference, all this kind of stuff, and is it going to make a difference compared to China, who maybe doesn't care as much, or India, and they're taking off industrially, and all that kind of conversation, right? Now, what I want to, so just to be clear, right, the shutdown is when the House and the Senate aren't doing what they're supposed to do, which is to eventually pass the same bill, right? Because they can't agree. When things are flowing, there's always some debate, there's negotiation, there's maybe some compromise, and then they pass the bill. The government shutdown happens when that does not happen, right? You do not get anybody agreeing on the major issues, whether that's climate, whether that's border security, whether that's Social Security, whatever it is you're talking about, let's say out of the 12 main categories of bills, and things are just not getting passed. Okay, and so now the funding is drying up, right? Again, the legislative branch of the government is controlling the purse. It's supposed to say, okay, pass the bills. Here's the budgeting. Now the executive branch can go do what it does, and the judicial branch can do what it does. But everything kind of comes to a halt, right? And it has those trickle-down effects that I talked about: Social Security, mortgages, small business loans, military not getting paid, the TSA not, brutally understaffed, flights are no longer, whatever, right? Everything just kind of, agencies aren't getting their money. They can't inspect the foods and the drugs and all that kind of stuff. And now, so when a lockdown happens, again, there's essential services that are still there, but a lot of those people that are doing the essential services aren't getting paid. So you start getting a pressure. Now, what's happening here is almost all of what you hear during a shutdown, which is true of politics in general, is performative, right? You're not necessarily hearing the real sides of negotiation, if they even exist, especially in the early stages of a lockdown. Like what is the real conversation around the border walls? Right? You're going to hear things like, well, maybe the Republicans are just xenophobic or they're just racist, right? That's not the real conversation. Some of that might be true, but that's not the real conversation, right? The real conversation would be like, what are the statistics about illegal immigrants coming in, and what are the statistics and the facts around what those illegal immigrants do and do not do, and does it stress the system, and is the infrastructure in place to support them? Are they not? or just the fact that they're breaking laws, that's the real conversation. But instead you hear like, oh, xenophobia or racist, that kind of stuff, right? What is the real conversation on Social Security, right? Is it, well, maybe all the Democrats do is just kind of keep, pumping money into Social Security programs because they think that's how they get the votes and they think it sounds compassionate, but yada, yada. Or maybe you're blaming the Republicans and saying they don't really care about people. It's not real conversation, right? It's just symbolic, performative stuff. If it's climate change, right? Like, what's the real conversation there? What is the actual stats? What's real, right? Instead of saying things like, oh, well, they just think it's a hoax, or the other side just, again, wants to do it because they want to look like they're compassionate, or they want to sink their teeth into some cause, but it's not necessarily practical. How is the money actually getting used for those causes? You don't get those real conversations for the most part, at least especially in the early stages of a lockdown. You're just getting the performative, symbolic rhetoric. And that rhetoric is in place because the House and the Senate are basically trying to appeal to their base, right? Whatever side you're on. So the Republicans are trying to appeal to their base. The Democrats are trying to appeal to their base, and they're doing that for obvious reasons, right? Because they want to get the votes and they want to make their demographic happy, right? And just unfortunately, based on human nature, right? Humans react and respond to emotionally triggering rhetoric more than maybe boring, nuanced facts about, a negotiation between the House and the Senate. So it becomes very performative, and you end up getting this kind of false signal in the system because it's not real. It's not the rhetoric is not based on what matters. You're not really learning anything about climate change. You're not really learning anything about border security. You're not learning anything about how Social Security works or what some of those nuanced topics are, which is what you would need to deal with in order to resolve the issue, right? So it is a system, a network where the information flowing is now become kind of toxic, poisoned, contaminated in the form of just really wrong, hollow, vacuous information that you can't even act on. And everybody's just doing things kind of emotionally, including the general public, and then as well as the senators and the representatives and the members of the Congress, just to say members of Congress in general, right? Okay, so lockdown, it does affect our lives, especially the longer it goes on. We took a look at, kind of Civics 101 structure of the government, and now we're understanding that as the guts of the Congress aren't flowing the way they're supposed to because the House and the Senate can't pass the same bill. This is why the lockdown ends up happening. The money stops flowing, and everything just becomes performative and symbolic. Now, what we see in a system like this, right, whether it's government or something else, is you kind of have these two channels of information flow. You can call these different things. Let's just say we call it the policy channel and we call it the symbolic channel, right? The policy channel is the information that's supposed to be flowing for the actual negotiations and conversations to happen. The real, genuine information, right? Not the symbolic, not the performative stuff, right? The policy channel is the actual real information. The symbolic channel is all these gestures that are being made to appeal to the base or the bases. Right? It's the performance stuff. And so what you're doing in a system like this is you're actually robbing the information from the policy channel, right? The actual nuanced negotiation that's supposed to be happening, the real issues, the real conversations. Like, what's the real conversation about the climate, about the, right, whatever. That's the policy channel. That's where it's supposed to be. It's not like it's 50-50. You're robbing it out of there, and everyone's just trying to appeal to the base. So now you have this system, this network that is not using the information it's supposed to have. You can almost imagine like the human brain, right? And it's not able to process information it's supposed to. It's just getting false signals everywhere. Maybe it's somewhat analogous to, like, I don't know, a schizophrenic brain or something, right? Where it's illusory, it's deceptive, it's not the signals that are supposed to be there for a healthy, complex network to function the way it does. This is what essentially is happening in a government shutdown, right? You're starving the proper information channels, and you're bringing the information over to other channels that essentially halt the system, and if went long enough would actually destroy the system, right? It's toxic to it. So there's only so much information to go around. There's only so much attention span that people have. And so if you don't appropriate information to the right channels, it's going to be a toxic thing. And this is true for all systems. Okay, so that's kind of the core invariant property of a system like this. Now, that is not just something that occurs solely in in government. I want to give you two kind of examples from science and technology where you see this similar idea. Nature just came out with something called a citation diversity statement, citation diversity statements. This was in Nature Reviews Psychology. It's actually encouraging authors to include a citation diversity statement to draw attention to citation imbalances that will confirm that the scientists essentially made efforts to cite publications from a diverse group of researchers. Now, on the face, that might not sound that bad. Like, okay, diversity, research. Okay, the problem is this doesn't have anything to do with genuine research or epistemic understanding or the pursuit of truth. This is trying to layer something socially on top of science so that the outcome looks the same for people of different races, different backgrounds, different creeds, whatever it is, right? And so again, it's not that diversity is bad, but the problem is you're shifting information away from the channel that it's supposed to be in science, which is about replication, which is about evidence, which is about proper citation in terms of just citing work that is actually relevant, and then you're shifting the attention span and the only amount of information that's available, the limited amount, over to another channel, which is much more performative and symbolic, right? It's not that diversity is bad, but when you do something like this in science, you have to have a citation diversity statement. It is a symbolic gesture, right? It has nothing to do with science itself. There's no reason to believe that's necessarily going to improve the quality of science. And to show, and I want to be clear about this, right? Diversity in science is great, but diversity needs to emerge naturally, right? If you start forcing it like this, you're going to start getting people doing things for the wrong reasons, right? You already have a real problem in the replication space in science, right? There's the replication, reproducibility or in reproducibility crisis. Let's just call it the reproducibility crisis, right? Where a lot of, especially in psychology and social sciences, you can't reproduce the work that's been done very well. I think it's sitting at about 70% last time I checked. 70% of studies can't be replicated. That's a problem in science. It goes against the efficacy of science to do what it's supposed to do. It obviously erodes the trust in science as an enterprise. So when you take so why does the replication crisis occur? Well, people start becoming more concerned with how many papers they publish, who is citing who. It becomes more about politics. It's all these symbolic gestures. You're taking the limited resource of information that you have available to apply to science, and you're putting it into the wrong channel, which is much more performative and symbolic based. It's the same thing. This is an example of that, right? Let's do science for the sake of science. Let's do good science. Let's try to pursue truth, not try to layer on symbolic gestures that are going to make, let's say certain people happy. And now that it's not like you can just do both. It's not like you can just split up the information between channels. They tend to be far more mutually exclusive. You end up with things like the replication crisis, and this is going to arguably contribute to that. Again, diversity in science is great. Let's have diversity emerge naturally because different people are interested and they do things, not try to force the diversity. Now, of course, this gets into a bigger topic about, how should we do this in schooling? How should the gatekeepers control who gets in, right? Affirmative action and all that kind of stuff. But I think when it comes to something like this, you can't just, have your cake and eat it too. There's a limited amount of information to deal with, and you have to think about which channel you're applying it to. The science channel is about doing good science. It's about making sure it's not about how many papers. It's not about who you're citing, right? That's a problem in science in general, and I think this is a current event example of that. Another one in the technology space is there's actually a paper that came out called What I Eat in a Day hashtag, which is the quality, accuracy, and engagement of nutrition content on TikTok. And so what's found is, when you actually study what people are looking at on TikTok, especially let's say the top 200 most popular posts on something like nutrition, is you're getting a lot of bad information there, things that aren't really backed up. They're not necessarily evidence-based. We know that in social media, things get amplified just because they're emotional, right? Or they're triggering, they're charged. They're not necessarily particularly accurate. And, we're talking about people's nutrition. You can also see this in the mental health space, right? And so there's all kinds of advice and quote unquote facts that are floating out around there that are not necessarily backed up. And a study like this takes a look at things like conflict of interest, which is not being admitted, right? Like people aren't admitting that there's actually a conflict of interest here. So it's this what type of information are we dealing with? Are we actually building social media platforms to keep it in the quote unquote policy channel, the right information that people are supposed to be getting at? Or are we, and not that there's no debate there about, well, what's right and what's true, but let's at least focus on that, as opposed to amplifying specifically the symbolic channel, which is more like the emotionally charged things, no different than trying, a bunch of senators trying to appeal to their base when they talk about the government shutdown, as opposed to actually talking about the real conversations, the real issues about the policies or the bills that are not being passed and why they're not being passed, right? It's the same type of thing. So anyway, just a really quick recap. I said at the beginning, look, the government shutdown, you might not care about politics, but it does affect everyone's life because, if the legislative branch, right, of the government controls the purse, and it's the flow of the money, and that flow of money goes to the agencies, and they're inspecting the food, and they're, home, mortgages and small loans and Social Security and things that actually affect our lives, that money stops flowing, then there's going to be services that stop in our real life, and that's going to impact us. And the longer it goes, the worse it gets. We took a look at the basic breakdown of the government structure. Again, I think most of you know that, but nice just to have a little bit of recap on that. What the legislative branch does versus the executive branch versus the judicial. The fact that you have the Congress, the guts of that is both the House and the Senate, and they have to pass the same bill. Then we start talking about the lockdown in terms of the Congress not doing what it needs to do, which is getting both the House and the Senate to pass the same bill. We can understand why they don't pass those same bills, right? They obviously don't agree on major issues, whether that's climate, whether that's security, right, defense, whether that's Social Security, all that kind of stuff. All of that is very performative. It's a false signal, and as a core property here, we're getting information in the wrong channel. There's only so much information to go around. There's only so much attention span, but we're focusing on the symbolic, gestural type stuff, which is like a toxic false signal in a network. It's got to go back to the policy stuff. It's got to go back to the real negotiation points so we can understand what's needed. And we saw this in examples like with the citation diversity statements in Nature and the nutritional and kind of psychological mental health stuff that's on TikTok. Wrong information in the wrong channel. Let's get the information into the right channel. It's a core property. Eventually, there's going to be enough pressure, right? Eventually, the shutdowns end because the markets start putting pressure. Senators can't take their flights. People can't. Everybody starts talking and putting pressure. Really, the market starts to eventually correct itself as free markets do, and people are only going to put up with this for so long. Yeah, I guess that's pretty much it. I think that. I think it's just important to understand how these lockdowns work, and to give you a more kind of rational lens with which to look at it. I guess there's only so much you can do as an individual, but it's important to understand how representation works. It's important to understand how much representative power your individual voice has. When you talk about districts and you talk about state representation, and just think about how things can get pressured and how markets eventually correct themselves, and just understand this as a pattern that isn't just about government, right? You see this in other areas, technology space. You see this in all kinds of networks in science, because that's what this is. The government is set up as essentially a network of many, many interacting parts, and when it comes to information, it's a complex thing. So you have to understand those properties and what's at play. Okay. All right, that's it for this episode. I hope that all made sense. I hope that was a little bit helpful. Apologize if you knew a lot of that already, but hopefully that gave you a little bit more rational lens with which to look at the current government shutdown. Let's hope it ends soon. All right, thanks everyone for listening. And for those of you who are watching, until next time, take care.